What if I told you that the specific way your doctor was trained, the structure of the world's biggest tech companies, and the struggle of a traditional date farmer in the Moroccan desert are all dictated by the same organizational blueprint?
A blueprint from over a century ago.
Exactly. It sounds like three completely separate worlds.
It does. But, the thread connecting them isn't some kind of coincidence. It's a meticulously designed system, a system of concentrated power and global influence.
And we've been digging through this really comprehensive stack of sources you provided. I mean, everything from early 20th century corporate trusts to the political ecology of North Africa.
Right. And what we're going to do is trace that lineage of influence.
So our mission today is to really unpack how the organizational genius of industrial titans, like John D. Rockefeller, set the architecture for modern systemic control.
We're going to follow that blueprint from its origin.
From American business and public health, and then see how it's being applied right now, today, to dictate global development outcomes.
Which, as we'll see, often creates this profound marginalization for some of the most vulnerable communities.
Okay, so what's the core thesis that's really uniting all of this material?
It's that successful large-scale influence, the kind that lasts for generations, it relies on two things that have to be masterfully executed.
Two things, okay.
First is standardization.
Standardization of what?
Of markets, of professional knowledge, even educational curricula. You make everyone play by the same rules.
And the second thing?
Systemic control. Control over the infrastructure of power.
So not just money.
Not just money. We're talking oil pipelines, medical schools, or, as we'll get into, strategic resources like land and water. The structures created back then are still calling the shots worldwide.
So let's start at the very beginning of this blueprint. John D. Rockefeller Sr. Everyone knows him as the archetype of the industrial monopoly.
The ultimate capitalist.
Right. But the irony is he's also seen as the father of modern strategic philanthropy. So how did his approach go from just simple charity to becoming this engine for societal engineering?
Well, it was a massive, and I'd say a forced evolution. Initially, JDR was a narrow, deeply religious man.
Right. His early giving was all tied to his faith.
Almost entirely. It was focused on the Baptist church. He was a devout practitioner of tithing, giving away 10% of his income.
So he supported institutions like the University of Chicago Spelman College.
He did. But then by around 1910, his personal fortune it exploded.
We're talking unprecedented numbers.
Completely. Around $1 billion at the time, which meant he was just, overwhelmed. Thousands upon thousands of requests for money were flooding in.
I can't even imagine that deluge. You can't possibly vet every single letter personally.
Exactly right. And that administrative nightmare is what prompted him to bring in a man named Frederick Gates.
And Gates is the key here.
Gates was the catalyst. He looked at that mountain of requests and basically argued that they had to organize their philanthropy as though it were a business.
Apply corporate principles to giving.
Yes. Gates came to the conclusion that traditional charity was just utterly inefficient. It only addressed the symptoms. Feeding the poor for a day, treating the sick temporarily.
He wanted to get at the roots of the problem.
Precisely. Gates convinced Rockefeller that if you want true, lasting impact, you have to aim for systemic change. You have to target the underlying social problems.
Like poverty, ignorance.
Poverty, ignorance, disease, and very notably, he included racism in that list. This pivot from reactive charity to proactive system-level architecture, that's the real genesis of modern strategic philanthropy.
So it's not just about giving someone a fish.
No, it's about permanently altering the entire fishing industry.
But surely this was met with intense public backlash. I mean, the idea of a massive corporation taking over social policy sounds immediately suspect.
Oh, tremendous suspicion. When the Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in 1913, public sentiment against industrial monopolies was incredibly high.
People were already afraid of his power.
Deeply distrustful. They were asking, what's the real motivation behind this massive new foundation? And that suspicion actually forced JDR and his son, Junior, to operate the foundation with extreme care.
They had to manage public perception.
They understood that they had to actively engineer public trust to make their systemic interventions palatable and ultimately successful.
And that template for centralized, comprehensive, systemic control, that was perfected years earlier in the market, wasn't it, with the Standard Oil Trust?
Precisely. The Standard Oil Trust, which was established back in 1882, is the fundamental blueprint. It's the model for almost every modern corporate power structure we see today.
It wasn't just about drilling for oil.
No, not at all. It was about designing an organizational mechanism for what the sources call comprehensive monopoly architecture.
Okay, let's unpack that architecture because it really does define modern capitalism. What were the key elements?
There were three critical interlocking mechanisms. First one was vertical integration.
Controlling the whole supply chain.
The entire thing, from the oil fields and the wells to the refineries to the tank cars and pipelines that move the product, right down to the retailer.
So no one could compete because Standard Oil owned the infrastructure you needed to even get your product to market.
Exactly. Controlling the logistics gave them an insurmountable advantage. Then the second element was horizontal consolidation.
Buying up or crushing the competition.
Yes, the aggressive acquisition or destruction of competitors to control the market share itself. By buying up or driving out every regional competitor, they could fix prices and control supply.
And the third piece, which is often less discussed but maybe the most crucial, was preemptive regulatory capture.
Yes, this is key. Anticipating and then influencing state and federal rules to solidify their dominance. The trust itself was essentially a clever way to skirt anti-monopoly laws by having trustees hold the stock of multiple companies.
But the Supreme Court eventually broke them up.
They did, in 1911. But the trust itself simply evolved. It became what we now recognize as the holding company model.
Which is the exact mechanism used by modern corporate giants.
The exact one.
So when we look at, say, Alphabet today, which owns Google or JP Morgan or even Amazon, are we literally looking at the descendants of that Standard Oil structure?
Structurally, yes. Think about the holding company model. Alphabet controls Google, Waymo, DeepMind, and so on as separate subsidiaries.
But the power is centralized at the top.
Exactly, at the top holding level. This lets them optimize their financial, legal, and regulatory leverage.
And Amazon, with its vertical integration.
A perfect modern example. They own logistics, cloud computing with AWS, and the retail market share. This blueprint, rooted in Standard Oil's design for concentrating control while navigating legal hurdles, it remains the primary way global wealth and corporate influence are structured and exerted today.
So once they mastered the architecture of corporate control, they turned their attention to standardizing knowledge. And the most consequential application of this blueprint was the transformation of American medicine.
It's just astonishing in its scope. The Rockefeller Foundation, and they often partnered with the Carnegie Foundation on this, they poured unprecedented funds into reforming medical education in the early 20th century.
And here's that immense irony you brought up earlier. JDR himself didn't have great faith in conventional medicine.
None at all. He often favored alternative approaches, like homeopathy for his own health issues.
So if the financier didn't believe in the product, why make such a massive investment?
Because the investment was strategic, it wasn't personal, it aligned perfectly with the dominant scientific shift of the time towards bacteriology, the germ theory.
And by extension, with the pharmaceutical and pathology industries that were just starting to boom.
Of course. If you can standardize medical education around the idea of germ theory, then you standardize the solution around drugs and intervention.
The focus shifts.
It shifts entirely from treating the body as a holistic system, an ecosystem, to isolating and treating specific pathogens and symptoms.
Which brings us to the pivotal document that cemented this whole standardization. The Flexner Report of 1910.
This report is a classic example of influence being wielded through the standardization of knowledge infrastructure. Abraham Flexner, and this is the critical part, he was an educator who had no medical degree or medical training himself.
Not a doctor.
Not a doctor. He was commissioned to assess 155 medical schools across the US and Canada, and his report was absolutely scathing.
What was his main criticism?
He criticized the vast majority for lacking scientific rigor, specifically the kind of rigorous laboratory science he felt was necessary for modern research.
And the fallout from that report was immediate and catastrophic for the existing system.
Drastic is an understatement. The report led to the closure of nearly half of all U.S. medical schools within just a few years.
But the closures weren't random, were they?
Not at all. There was a clear pattern. Schools that were dedicated to holistic and traditional practices, homeopathy, eclectic medicine, naturopathy.
The ones that focused on nutrition, botanicals, lifestyle changes.
All of those were disproportionately targeted and eliminated. They were deemed unscientific because their curriculum didn't align with this new, centralized, laboratory-focused model that Flexner was championing.
So this wasn't just about increasing quality across the board. It was about defining what counted as quality medicine, and then eliminating everything else.
Exactly. The surviving institutions, which were then heavily funded and endowed by Rockefeller and Carnegie money, all adopted what became known as the German model.
Which focused on what, specifically?
It focused relentlessly on laboratory research, detailed anatomy, pathology, the study of disease, and pharmacology.
And what's the long-term systemic effect of that standardization? We're living with it today.
We absolutely are. It's cemented the system we primarily rely on now, a reactive healthcare model.
It's brilliant at emergencies.
Fantastic at acute care. But it prioritized pathology, surgery, and pharmacology treating symptoms in acute disease with drugs and procedures.
And what got pushed to the side?
Disciplines that focused on prevention, nutrition, environmental health, or the patient's lifestyle as root causes. All of that was pushed to the margins. It got relegated to alternative medicine or just dismissed entirely.
So we are still grappling with the consequences of that 1910 standardization, a system that's incredibly effective at acute care, but systemically ill-equipped to handle chronic, lifestyle-driven diseases.
Which are, of course, the biggest health crises we face today.
This impulse towards standardization wasn't limited to medicine. It was also applied to molding society itself, particularly through public education, if you're building a massive industrial machine.
You need a predictable, compliant workforce.
Exactly.
And that's the social control layer of this blueprint. The industrial philanthropists realized that to sustain the complex industrial machinery created by Standard Oil and its successors, they needed a standardized supply of labor.
So they invested massively in public education. But the focus wasn't necessarily on fostering independent critical thinking.
No, what was the goal then?
The goal was creating what the sources call a nation of workers.
A nation.
The curriculum, the structure, it was all designed to instill compliance, promptness, and proficiency in repetitive labor skills.
The exact skills you'd need on an assembly line or in a large corporate office.
The system was optimized for efficiency and predictability. Just like the factory floor, it mirrored the industrial organization.
And speaking of social control and, addressing the root causes of social issues, the sources point to a much darker, ethically fraught aspect of this foundational philanthropic drive.
Eugenics funding.
Yes. The quest to systematize and scientifically manage societal problems led major philanthropies, and that includes the Rockefeller and Carnegie organizations, to heavily fund eugenics research in the early 20th century.
How was that framed? How did they manage to get that accepted?
Well, it was an attempt to use what they perceived as objective science and organizational principles to shape human populations, to manage societal burdens like crime or poverty. It was framed under the guise of modernization and scientific progress.
The idea that complex social problems could be solved scientifically, just like a business problem could be solved by organizational genius.
Exactly. The goal was creating a more efficient, less burdened society. But it starkly illustrates how that impulse to standardize, control, and systematize, when you apply it to human populations and biology, can lead down some profoundly damaging and discriminatory paths.
It just shows the immense power these foundations had to define what was acceptable social science and what wasn't.
Absolutely. So if we step back for a second, the link is clear. The architecture of control, perfected by Rockefeller's trust, it wasn't just about oil. It was a scalable organizational strategy.
If you standardize the knowledge, like with medicine, or the workforce, like with education,
you gain systemic control over the entire outcome.
Which sets the stage perfectly for how that system was then exported globally.
Right.
So we've established how corporate and intellectual power was standardized domestically. Now let's transition to the global stage and see how that framework of intensive industrial application translated onto physical resources, land, and water, starting with the Green Revolution.
The Green Revolution, which really got going in the 1940s, was, on the surface, a humanitarian effort.
Championed by the U.S. government, private entities like the Rockefeller Foundation, and also the Ford Foundation.
Right. And the stated goal was to combat massive post-World War II food shortages, particularly in Asia. The method was to introduce high-yielding varieties, HYVs, of staple crops.
So new types of wheat and rice.
New wheat and rice, plus synthetic fertilizers and advanced irrigation techniques.
And it certainly delivered huge productivity increases in countries like India and Mexico.
It did, no question. But that productivity came with a massive social and economic contradiction that, frankly, deepened inequalities. Because this model was inherently high input, you needed expensive seeds, massive amounts of synthetic fertilizers, and really complex irrigation technologies.
Which means only the wealthy landowners could actually afford to participate fully.
Precisely. It overwhelmingly favored capital-rich farmers. And the sources show that this infusion of high-cost technology and capital led to a significant acceleration of land consolidation.
So the small traditional farmers get pushed out.
They were either forced out of business because they couldn't afford the inputs, or they went into perpetual debt trying to adopt them, which led to foreclosure and displacement. The promise of food security was fulfilled through a system that actively marginalized the poorest farmers.
It sounds like the Standard Oil model applied to agriculture. You vertically integrate the inputs, the seeds and fertilizer, and then you consolidate the land horizontally.
That's the pattern, exactly. And critically, this standardized industrial model largely bypassed the African continent.
Right. Why was Africa excluded from this massive push, especially given the vulnerability of its food systems?
Well, it was primarily because of two deep structural issues, both of them rooted in colonial history. First, colonial economic structures had successfully warped the agricultural focus across much of Africa.
Toward exporting raw materials.
Exactly. Cash crops like cocoa, coffee, or cotton, rather than building robust, localized food systems based on native staples for their own people.
And the second issue.
The necessary infrastructure for the Green Revolution was just non-existent. These high-yield varieties were incredibly water-intensive, but Africa had almost no irrigation infrastructure.
The numbers on that are pretty stark.
They are. Look at the figures. Less than 6% of cultivated land in Africa is irrigated. Compare that to 37% in Asia, which benefited heavily from the revolution.
So without widespread, reliable water access, the standardized high-yield model was just a non-starter for most African farmers.
It was. And it forced a continued dependence on rain-fed agriculture and ultimately on external markets.
That dependency cycle really sets the stage for what's happening today, where the control and appropriation of physical resources continue. You mentioned the concept of territorial hoarding. That sounds like a sophisticated term for land grabbing.
It's a broader strategy than just buying land. Territorial hoarding is the physical appropriation of space coupled with the deliberate imposition of a new economic value system.
And industrial expansion requires this shift.
It does. The ultimate goal of this new agriculture is to fundamentally transform local farmers. Farmers who traditionally see their land as a cultural, ancestral, and ecological unit.
Into what the sources call Homo economicus.
Yes. Explain that concept in this context.
It's the economic theory that sees humans as purely rational actors, motivated solely by economic self-interest and profit maximization.
Right. So for the industrial model to work, the farmer has to stop prioritizing things like resilience, cultural heritage, or community ties.
And focus exclusively on economic productivity.
On profit margins and maximizing yield for external markets. This fundamentally severs the deep cultural and ecological connections to the territory.
And these land grabs always come with an implicit grab of the water.
Absolutely. This is the crucial link. When large tracts of land are acquired for high yield, often export-oriented agriculture in arid or semi-arid regions, it places immense unsustainable stress on water systems.
This leads to what's called water grabbing.
Exactly. And you can see the mechanical advantage the industrial system has over the smallholder.
How does that play out on the ground?
It's the ability to drill. Large-scale industrial farms have the technology and capital to drill deep wells, often reaching 300 meters or more to access deep aquifers.
And that technology is completely unavailable to smallholder farmers.
Completely. Their traditional wells typically only reach maybe 20 to 30 meters. So when the industrial farms start pumping from 300 meters, they inevitably drain the shallower water table.
The small farmer's well runs dry first.
Every time. It intensifies competition and effectively monopolizes the resource.
And this exploitation is often facilitated by ambiguous legal frameworks, right?
Yes. In so many contemporary land acquisition contracts across Africa, water usage rights are often undefined, superficial, or simply excluded from precise definition.
And that ambiguity is a feature, not a bug.
It's a feature. It enables exploitation. For instance, in some Ethiopian horticulture projects, investors secured extensive implicit water rights simply by controlling the land. This allowed them to redirect previously communal or traditional irrigation flows to their large, exclusive operations.
It's really hard not to see the ghost of colonialism in this modern structure.
It's a direct systemic echo. Colonial administrations systematically redefined communal or indigenous land ownership systems. They would often declare vast tracts of land as unowned, vacant or idle.
which legally justified its expropriation.
Exactly. They could then allocate it to settler populations or export-oriented agribusinesses. This move legalized the dispossession of indigenous populations and, at the same time, created a readily exploitable labor pool for the expanding industrial sector.
So, when a modern state acts as an intermediary today, reclassifying communal land as available for lease to a multinational agribusiness, they are using the exact same legal logic established under colonial rule.
Precisely. The legal systems inherited from the colonial era often prioritize centralized state control over traditional communal governance. This makes it far easier for powerful elites to accumulate land under the guise of modernization and economic development, which just entrenches the structural inequalities.
And the final tragic irony of this entire system:
the people who produce the vast majority of the world's food are the people who are suffering the most hunger.
the numbers are just appalling.
They are. Smallholder farmers account for an estimated 60 to 80% of global food production, yet they suffer disproportionately severe hunger.
And a staggering 75% of the global population living in extreme poverty resides in rural areas.
So the global focus on export-oriented industrial agriculture means that the world's most food-insecure continent, Africa, often sacrifices its critical resources, its most fertile land, and its precious water to feed external markets.
It just perpetuates a self-defeating cycle of dependency and deprivation for its own rural citizens.
A vicious cycle.
That structural reality brings us to our specific case study, the Rockefeller region in Morocco. This is where the pressure of global economic systems meets an extremely fragile, traditional, semi-desert ecosystem.
This region is a perfect microcosm of the systemic costs we've been discussing. Drada is geographically Morocco's largest region.
But it's also its poorest.
It's poorest. And crucially, 90% of its economy depends on agriculture, centered heavily on date palm cultivation. They produce 77% of the entire nation's dates.
In a semi-desert environment, that level of reliance on agriculture, especially water-intensive date farming, is inherently risky.
The resource fragility is acute. The region faces brutal temperatures, often well over 40 degrees Celsius, and it relies almost entirely on fragile, deep groundwater.
And the nation as a whole is incredibly water-stressed.
Very. Agriculture consumes over 85% of Morocco's water. And the forecasts are grim. They're projecting precipitation declines of up to 15% in this region alone by 2030. The system is past its breaking point.
And this fragility is exacerbated by that colonial history we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Just like in the broader African context, this region was historically marginalized by the French colonial Le Maroc Utile framework.
The useful Morocco policy.
Right. This policy prioritized development and investment in the coastal, urban, and more fertile areas. It left arid regions like Rockefeller reliant on their traditional, often Berber and Arab communal management systems.
And that colonial neglect systematically weakened and undermined those traditional resilient governance structures.
It did, which made the region much more vulnerable to modern exploitation.
Okay, so post-decolonization, Morocco launches a major policy intervention to address both growth and rural poverty. This is the Plan Maroc Vert, or PMV, in 2008.
Yeah.
But this plan seemed to pit two competing priorities directly against each other.
That's the core tension of the PMV. It was structured into two pillars. Pillar I was focused on high-value, export-oriented agriculture.
Driving economic growth through commercial success.
Right. This pillar attracted large-scale commercial farms, significant foreign investment from places like the UAE, Germany, and France, and it benefited wealthy domestic entrepreneurs who were quickly able to consolidate large tracts of land and monopolize the water.
So Pillar Vine is essentially the adoption of that standardized industrial efficiency blueprint we traced all the way back to Rockefeller.
It is. It's prioritizing economic efficiency and integration into global value chains. These large enterprises often focus on crops like citrus, melons, or even strawberries for European export,
which are incredibly water intensive.
and thereby directly competing with local subsistence farming for that scarce water.
Yeah. But the plan did have a counterbalancing equity component, right? Pillar 2.
Pillar to second was the social equity pillar. It was explicitly designed to support smallholder livelihoods and reduce poverty.
And the sources show that nationally, the PMV did achieve some impressive social gains.
It did. The income poverty rate dropped significantly between 2001 and 2014, and household access to drinking water reached over 90%.
And the government put in place some concrete incentives for small farmers.
Yes, they did. For example, the government heavily subsidizes irrigation costs. Farmers pay just 4 cents per cubic meter of water.
And small farmers, those with up to 5 hectares, they get 100% coverage for the irrigation expenses.
Right. They also get support to replace old date palms with certified disease-resistant varieties from state laboratories. So you can see there's a genuine intent by the local government to buffer the effects of this modernization.
But if they're prioritizing pillar height as growth goals, how effective can pillar to second really be? It sounds like you're trying to run a marathon and a sprint at the same time.
Well, the implementation of Pillar II was structurally challenged from the start. Critics point out that it often treated small farmers as passive recipients of aid.
Not as active participants with valuable local knowledge.
Exactly. And more fundamentally, the PMV prioritized economic growth over sustainability for years. The initial 2008 framework didn't even include environmental criteria.
They're only added later.
They were belatedly introduced in 2011, and even then, without clear, precise evaluation metrics for ecological impact.
And once again, external influence played a crucial role here. Much like the Flexner Report redefined medical knowledge a century ago.
Absolutely. The PMV relied heavily on external consulting firms like McKinsey, and it adopted standardized international best practices,
which marginalized the crucial local agricultural knowledge.
It sidelined the insights of Moroccan researchers who actually understood the specific fragile ecosystems of the oases. Local experts noted that agronomy students are now trained in managing project value chains, not the complexities of family farming systems.
It just reinforces the notion that agriculture is a textbook neoliberal business, completely disconnected from its socio-ecological context.
It's a clash of worldviews.
The standardized global model versus centuries of local adaptation. And that clash has profound long-term costs.
Yes.
Which brings us to the human cost of all this. Cultural erosion and displacement. If industrial farms are monopolizing water and land through Pillar of the Earth, the traditional smallholders have to leave.
That's the inevitable systemic outcome. Rural-urban migration is accelerating across Morocco. It's projected to make 68.5% of the population urban by 2050.
An immense demographic shift.
And it's driven directly by resource scarcity and economic marginalization.
And what are the people who are migrating reporting as their most significant loss?
It's the cultural degradation. For the residents, heritage and cultural knowledge are primary concerns. When younger generations leave the oases for the anonymous urban environments, the intergenerational transmission of specific critical agricultural knowledge just stops.
And that knowledge is deeply tied to their identity, their Berber and Arab identity.
It is, and it's essential for maintaining these resilient systems, like the oasis system itself.
Right, that's a very specific agricultural practice.
It is. Traditional farming in these oases relied on a 3-tiered system where the tall date palms create a critical microclimate. They shade the lower tiers of fruit trees and subsistence crops.
It's a complex, adapted system that maximizes resilience in a harsh climate.
And when those traditional practices are disrupted, when the farmers leave entire ways of life that were built on adaptation risk demise, heritage provides social cohesion and identity. The disruption of these practices risks unraveling the community's entire fabric in favor of individual economic survival in the city.
So Morocco's attempt at modernization, while it had some positive social outcomes through Pillar II, structurally it reinforces the concentration of power and resources laid out in that initial blueprint.
And the result is the erosion of the very cultural resilience that sustained the region for centuries. It's the ultimate tragedy of standardization. The desire for standardized, measurable economic efficiency trumps the intrinsic, unquantifiable value of ecological resilience and cultural heritage. The focus on external markets dictates the consumption of scarce internal resources.
Okay, so we've seen the corporate structure, the standardized knowledge, and the physical costs on the global stage. Now let's look at the highest evolution of the Rockefeller blueprint. The modern mechanism of systemic change used by global institutions today.
This is where things get really interesting.
The sources highlight something called strategic convenings.
Yeah.
What are these?
This is a fascinating insight into how influence is architected today. Modern foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, they rely on these highly structured strategic meetings or convenings.
And they're designed not just to discuss issues.
No, they're designed to actively forge long-term impact. They are the 21st century equivalent of organizing the Standard Oil Trust.
Okay, but how is this different from just a standard high-level conference?
It's about achieving long-term specific alignment among disparate, powerful actors. These convenings are used for highly focused goals,
Such as?
mapping a complex policy landscape, forging crucial alliances among previously disconnected groups, discovering a singular path forward on an emerging issue, or accelerating action within an existing coalition. The output is systemic change.
So these meetings are the genesis of major global initiatives.
The sources note that this process has been instrumental in creating massive global initiatives like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, or establishing the entire global field of impact investing.
So if the original blueprint was about controlling the infrastructure, this modern tool is about controlling the infrastructure of consensus.
That's a great way to put it.
How is this strategic design engineered to build that clarity and confidence on what comes next?
The architecture of the meeting is everything. The process is engineered to transform merely interested parties into committed, action-oriented coalitions.
And how do they do that?
They achieve this by eliminating ambiguity and preventing groups from getting stuck on the challenges. The design focuses relentlessly on pushing participants toward actionable next steps.
Yeah, it's very forward-looking.
Very. As one participant noted, the purpose statement is paramount. He said, "If you can't say it in one sentence, then you're not going to be effective." That crisp North Star purpose ensures every hour of the meeting contributes to the desired outcome.
That clarity helps with momentum. But powerful global actors often have conflicting interests. How does the design manage those differences without the coalition immediately collapsing?
This is where strategic design really excels. It creates the specific energy needed to sustain a coalition over time. It bridges differences by explicitly encouraging and supporting what they call creative tension among stakeholders.
So they don't shy away from conflict.
They surface it. By surfacing and mediating divergent perspectives rather than ignoring them, the design team can build true, enduring alignment. The shared, highly structured experience creates trust, which is the foundational currency for long-term influence.
Can you give us a detailed example of this design arc in action?
A prime example is the formation of the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, or GEATP. Its objective was incredibly complex, securing massive buy-in, attracting partners, and finalizing financial commitments to launch a new Global Energy Alliance.
A huge undertaking.
Huge. So their design used a clearly defined arc: kickoff, explore, refine, and launch. Each stage was sequenced and deliberate, focused entirely on securing alignment among the principals, the high-level leaders, and finalizing the commitments necessary for the launch.
So the structure ensures that the outcome isn't left to chance.
It's architected from the very start.
And what about a policy-focused example, maybe on domestic issues?
The sources mention the tax policy convening journey. The North Star purpose there was to align extremely disparate stakeholder groups. We're talking labor, philanthropy, policy experts.
Groups that don't normally see eye to eye.
At all. But the goal was to get them around a common vision for a better tax landscape for working people.
And it worked.
This sequential convening journey created new relationships and fostered collaboration. The end result was an agreed-upon plan with clear ownership for actions going forward. The designers provided the marker to go for and helped build the coalition energy that sustained the work far past that initial meeting.
It really accelerates systemic change dramatically beyond what just financial grants could ever achieve alone.
It does.
So it truly is the ultimate evolution of that initial blueprint. Standard Oil created the architecture to control the market.
The Flexner report created the architecture to control professional knowledge.
And today, strategic foundations are created the architecture to control global consensus and political action.
It just demonstrates that real power isn't just wealth, it's the mastery of organizational structure. Whether it's the corporate trust of 1882 or the strategic convening design of 2024, the goal is always systemic control, driving long-term, specific change on a global scale.
The sources reveal this stunning trajectory. From the 19th century mastery of organizational structure and the strategic standardization of knowledge, we can track a direct line to the consequences of exporting that standardized industrial efficiency model worldwide.
And we see that even when local governments, like Morocco's with the PMV, attempt to pursue dual goals, economic efficiency through Pillar SIR and social equity through Pillar SIL 2, the deeply entrenched global systems often prioritize the industrial model,
which perpetuates resource grabs and cultural marginalization. It shows how that blueprint of concentrated control can override even well-intentioned local efforts towards sustainability.
The system has its own momentum.
So you've seen how powerful foundations use structured design and these strategic convenings to align global leaders and secure long-term impact on everything from energy to tax policy. The next time you encounter a major new public policy shift or the launch of a massive global alliance, don't just ask who signed the checks.
Ask a different set of questions.
Ask this instead. Who organized the key players? What was the crisp, one-sentence North Star purpose of their initial meetings? And what coalition was quietly built, using creative tension and shared experience to ensure that specific outcome became a reality?
Because that is the invisible architecture defining global change today.